Well, welcome to my video on IFR radio organization. This short video is really intended for my early stage instrument students. And what I'd like you to do is to develop a strategy for consistently organizing your radios that builds a habit pattern that you'll use on every IFR flight. That'll make things a lot easier for you when you're in a very busy period. So this is a situation I run into quite often. Typically, you're being vectored around or you're beginning the approach sequence, and at some point, approach control calls and says, contact the tower. And all of a sudden, oh my goodness, where did I put the tower frequency, or what is the tower frequency? I've seen this happen an awful lot of times, even with experienced pilots. An important part of learning instrument flying is to build habit patterns that you can depend upon during busy periods. You just can't afford to be fumbling around with routine tasks. Getting ahead of the airplane is all about doing things in a standard way so that you don't have to spend a lot of brain power thinking about what to do next or where to go for a certain piece of information. So early in the program, I encourage my students to develop a plan for how to set up the radios in a standard way so that during busy periods, they're not fumbling around. It's one of the important things that you need to learn. The strategy depends upon your personal habits and the specifics of your airplane. Where's the audio panel located? How easy is it to get to the radios? Are both of my radios equally good, or do I have a radio that may not be as strong as others? And so I may want to change my strategy depending on what I happen to have in my airplane, which radios work best in different situations. So here's a schematic of a typical radio setup. I have 4 slots available for communications and 4 slots available for navigation. And I can flip between primary and secondary, or I can swap between radios number 1 and radio number 2. Most people set things up the way I've depicted here. Particularly in route, I might be on approach and then plan to do a flip to tower as directed. They'll put secondary information like AWOS and maybe ground in the secondary radio. The nav site is not particularly complicated. Most people try to keep their primary navigation in radio number 1, and they'll almost always set up any needed cross radios in radio 2. Typically on the nav side, radio 2 isn't doing much and is probably not used very often. So this approach works pretty good. The one concern I have with this approach is that if I get a late call to change approach control frequencies, that is, I've got the tower set up and ready to do a flip, and I get a call to change approach control frequencies late in the sequence. It's very easy to reach over and overwrite the tower frequency, and then I run into a problem where I don't have the tower immediately available. And one of the things that I recommend to my students, if they're following this strategy, is to put their tower frequency in their secondary of radio number 2, or even in the primary of radio 2 once they've gotten the AWOS. That way, at least tower frequency is guaranteed to be someplace immediately available, and I don't have to fumble for it. The other thing that you could do if you're following this approach is if you get a late call to change approach control frequencies, you can flip, put the new approach control frequency in secondary and flip back again, and that'll preserve tower in the secondary. So your goal is that whenever I have that change from approach to tower, or approach to advisory frequency, it's always going to be a flip. And that's really our goal, is that at that critical point in the sequence, we're always doing either a swap or a flip. So there's another way to set things up, and this is the way that I do it in my airplane. I happen to have a really excellent radio number 2. It's very easy to get to. It's actually the stronger of my 2 radios. And I always set it up so that my en route frequencies, my approach control frequencies, are in radio number 2. And that the local frequency, that is tower, ground, AWOS, etc., are always in radio 1. So that after takeoff, I always do a swap to go to approach control. And as I'm approaching the airport, I always do a swap back to tower or to advisory control. Now this has the advantage that if I get a late frequency change on approach control, that it doesn't disturb my tower frequency. And I'm always set up so that approaching the final approach fix, total call tower, it's always going to be a swap. It also helps that my audio control panel is in a convenient place in my panel so that it's a very easy reach to hit the swap button. Some people might have more difficulty with that. Some of the audio panels are a little more clumsy in order to make that swap. So in that case, you do want to change your strategy. So additionally, one could reverse this. That is, one could keep approach control in radio number 1 and the local controls in radio number 2. That's equally effective. It accomplishes the same thing. And again, our goal is always to do the same action at the same point in the approach procedure or the departure procedure. The nav side is pretty straightforward. There's not a lot of strategic thinking to be done about how to use the nav side. Most people are going to try to have their primary navigation reference on their number 1 radio, which is often driving perhaps an HSI or at least one of the OBSs that's in the primary field of view. Sometimes that number 2 OBS is buried somewhere in the cockpit. So your goal is generally to keep your primary nav on radio number 1. There is one consideration in all of this, and that is that our final approach guidance on a localizer must always be done on the localizer radio and not on the GPS. One of the more common mistakes that people make in check rides is to forget that they'll load the ILS approach with some sort of a GPS overlay on it, and all the elements of the approach will be flown on the GPS and everything works great. They turn on the final approach course and forget to set the GPS or to set the primary nav display to Vorlock. And unfortunately, the GPS provides the indications in your primary nav display looks very much like you would expect it to look as you're intercepting the localizer course. And so it's easy to forget to set that. So one of the things that we can do is to actually make this swap early. So you're looking at the Garmin 430 Nav 1 page here. And I wanted to point out that the Mach CDI, or the GPS CDI that is shown here in the picture, is always referenced to GPS. Now, every general aviation navigator that I've ever seen has some sort of a display that depicts something that looks like a course deviation indicator, and that is always referenced to GPS, regardless of whether or not you've selected Vorlock or GPS. The Vorlock GPS setting really determines what the remote display is going to be showing. So one of the strategies that you can use is if you're flying on GPS references for whatever reason, maybe flying to an intermediate fix or some other part of the approach. It's legal to use your GPS through all elements of the approach except the final approach course. So one of the things to do is to change to the Vorlock early in the approach sequence. That sets up your display in the localizer mode. But you can actually continue to fly the airplane using GPS guidance and this built-in GPS course deviation indicator. This works pretty well, but over the years I've observed that people don't use this function very much. It's typically not in the primary field of view, and so it isn't given the attention that it deserves. And also I think some people believe that changes when you change from GPS to Vorlock, when in fact it doesn't. It's always GPS. That's a great strategy when the approach procedure is partly being flown on GPS and then transitioning to the localizer. And so in conclusion, the goal is to develop a strategy and to follow a discipline for how you set up and use your radios. And I encourage students to do this early in their training so that they can reinforce those habits throughout their entire training program. And then that becomes a standard habit as they continue down, and that becomes their normal habit routine as an instrument pilot. Our goal is to develop the sequence of selections as we transition through the approach so that things are always happening in the same sequence. We always do a flip at the same time, we always do a swap at the same time, and that the frequencies are where we expect them. We don't have to fumble around. And it recognizes that sometimes you'll have to deviate. There are times when things don't work the way you expect them, but you try to get back on course as soon as you can. Well, I hope that you've gotten something out of this video. I hope that you'll take the time to think about how your airplane is set up and how you want to develop this standard procedure. If you were starting with me as a new student, one of the things that we would discuss early on is what is your strategy? And then we'll try to reinforce that strategy and develop that habit throughout our entire training program so that becomes a standard way of doing business in the cockpit. So thanks for watching.